What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 219. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today I'm talking to Dave DeCamp. He's the news editor at antiwar.com, and along with Jason Ditz is the reason why antiwar.com is the first place you need to go every day. Dave and Jason do such a great job of updating all the things that are happening within, the U.S. empire and war state, and without the mainstream media spin, right? So you could just read what's actually happening without having to hear the Iranian Batouthies and all the other little propaganda slogans and lines that the mainstream media will give you. So great to have Dave on again, and this is, as always, a great conversation. We're talking Russia, Iran, Yemen, looking at Biden's first year as president and his most recent press conference. So I'm sure you're going to love the show. Be sure to share the show. It will be at the Libertarian Institute and on the blog at antiwar.com. You could also find the show on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, everywhere you could listen to audio podcasts. It has a Twitter page at con_interest. I'm at Kyle Anzalone _ on Twitter. And then there's also a Facebook page for the show that you could follow. And, we post all the clips and all the episodes of the show there. You can support the show by donating. Patreon, Subscribestar, and crypto information are all in the show notes page. And you can support the show by doing your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE. That saves you 25% off when you spend $75 or more, and it gets the show a great kickback. They have a great lineup of products at Paloma Verde. I use the topicals. I absolutely love the sports cream. Nice menthol smell, works fast, lasts a long time. So check out all the great products they have at Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE. Help yourself, help the show. All right, now let's get into the interview with Dave DeCamp. Hey, Dave, how's it going? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest.
Good, Kyle. Thanks for having me back.
Happy to have you, and we're here on the, 1-year anniversary of Joe Biden being the president of the United States, and so got to review a little bit some of his foreign policy. Going to be talking about Yemen and Iran, but first, you wrote up yesterday, Biden gave what probably was the longest press conference so far of his presidency. A couple hours he was up there, and I don't know if he said much of anything, but you did write up the important stuff that he said about this Russia-Ukraine situation, which is, continuing to evolve. I believe there's actually going to be talks tomorrow. That'll be Friday the 21st between Blinken and Lavrov. That's the Russian foreign minister in Vienna. But Biden made some interesting statements. So tell us what happened.
Yeah, so in that, I think it was an hour and a half at least of his press conference. It was a total mess. It was kind of hard to follow. He's just kind of rambling, but he did the one thing he said that I thought was worth writing up was that he said that there's room to work with Russia on Putin's kind of his key demands. And the first one is that Ukraine won't ever join NATO. And then the other one is that the U.S. won't deploy missiles or other strategic weapons to Ukraine that could target Russia. On the NATO thing, Biden repeated the line that it's up to, I don't even know how he said it. It was such a jumbled mess. But basically what NATO and other U.S. officials have been saying, it's up to Ukraine to decide what they do. It's up to us. It's not up to a third country. And he said that, but then he also said that the likelihood of Ukraine joining NATO in the near term is unlikely. And he said, they have corruption, and I don't know if all NATO members would vote to join them. And it's always funny to hear Biden talk about Ukraine's corruption, because when he was vice president and the U.S. orchestrated a coup in the country, helped overthrow the government, and his son Hunter, which everybody knows this part, got a really high-paying job on the board of a Ukrainian natural gas company. I think it was like $50,000 a month. No experience. So it's always just funny to hear him say that. But I think that is kind of something. And it was interesting. It was actually David Sanger from the New York Times I was asking him the question, who was, he's just awful Sanger. But he managed to get an actual answer out of Biden. And so back in December, I think it was the Associated Press reported, citing some officials. They said that the Biden administration has made clear to Ukraine that there's no NATO membership for at least a decade. Now, is that kind of an informal promise enough for Russia? They seem to be really set on these. They want written guarantees that Ukraine won't ever join NATO. But we know that the U.S. has broken a similar promise at the end of the Cold War. They promised that NATO wouldn't expand eastward, and look what has happened. But maybe they could settle for a written thing, at least, in 10 years. Ukraine won't join NATO in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
Or something like that. We'll see. And then the other concern, the deploying missiles and stuff. I forget his exact quote, but I think he said, we can work something out on that. Yeah, and he said a word I didn't even understand what it was. That's why this is kind of tough to write yesterday. But he said something about as long as Putin agrees with deploying missiles in Russia, but near borders with European countries. So, of course, he had to qualify it with that, but. I think that is kind of saying something. And as you could see from the press conference, I mean, the media is out for blood. They're out for Russian blood right now. And it seems like there's all this hysteria. Putin's going to invade. Even a lot of people on our side are saying, yeah, well, he has no other choice because the U.S. isn't giving him an inch or anything. But I don't see it that way. I think Putin has nothing to gain from really invading Ukraine and trying to take out the government. I mean, that's kind of insane. But the one thing that could happen is, in the eastern Donbass region there, Luhansk and Luhansk, the separatist breakaway regions, some fighting could flare up there. And the U.S. has set it up that if anything flares up, even if it's Ukraine being the aggressor, they have said that Russia's planning a false flag there. And that was just a nonsense story. I'm sure you've talked about it.
Yeah.
That was just placed in the media and then repeated by the White House and Pentagon. So if something happens there, if there's a flare-up, it's going to be blamed on Russia no matter what. And then that could be the thing that the U.S. media and the establishment says, oh, see, we knew he was going to invade, and then they do sanctions or whatever. Yeah. So that's my concern, because that's a vulnerable area where anybody can kind of mess around. And there's a lot of factions, I think, that within the U.S. government that some want an escalation, some don't, and Biden's just not in control enough to really rein everybody in and keep them on the same page. So, but Blinken is talking to Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, tomorrow, like you said, on these guarantees. So hopefully, it's good that they're still talking. That's the good sign here.
Yeah. So, and I even do it on the show, and I think it is somewhat true that sometimes Biden just doesn't seem to maybe cognitively have it. However, on Ukraine policy, as you just explained, he laid this out better than I've seen anybody do in the mainstream, talking about U.S. officials and in the media in the past year. There are major problems with Ukraine joining NATO. It's not that France and Germany actually want that, right? The U.S. would have to get those two states to go along if it wanted to do it. And they really might not want to. Germany has said that they want the Nord Stream 2 stuff left out of that. So that realization is important. The corruption issue within Ukraine is important to recognize. And the fact that it's only Joe Biden doing it is very interesting. But I guess, and I asked this to Scott, the Horton, before everybody does, last time he was on the show, and I guess my concern is this: the Biden seems to want to give an informal kind of promise to Putin, which seems to make sense. I don't think it really made sense for Ukraine to join NATO in the next 10 years and everything like that, but he has a lot of difficult people in his administration, Victoria Nuland, Jade Sullivan, Antony Blinken, Wendy Sherman, all these people who are involved in the actual crafting and, talks with Russia on the policy level, I think kind of view Ukraine as a playground almost, where they could, go in, manipulate things and try to orchestrate and engineer a situation where they think that they could really come out ahead, whatever the hell that means. I think to me and you, that sounds absolutely insane, right? Like, what could they possibly do to set up Ukraine in a way where you're not drastically empowering the ultra nationalists, the super like kind of neo-Nazi Stefan Bandera worshipping types in Ukraine, and to not pick a fight with Russia, and to somehow give Ukraine the power to turn back a Russian invasion. I mean, it all seems crazy and insane, but at the same time, it kind of seems like, that's what they've been working on. We find out that they had this covert program for the past 7 years now, where they're training Ukrainian insurgents in the United States, and then they're giving 200 million and more weapons. Blinken just went to Kiev. They're saying, oh my God, Ukraine could invade every day, but let me go ahead and send the Secretary of State to the capital of that country. That sounds likely to me, Dave. But Blinken's there, and he pledges another $200 million in aid. They approve Estonia, Latvia, and with Lithuania to transfer more weapons to Ukraine. The UK is sending anti-tank missiles. Canada is sending special operation advisors. And so it really seems like, as Ted Galen Carpenter was writing about in November, that there are elements in the United States that are really trying to turn Ukraine into at least a de facto NATO member. And so maybe without an explicit pledge in writing from the US, it does come up short for Russia. And what kind of situation does that leave us in?
Well, yeah, I mean, you got to think that besides the membership, Russia they definitely want some guarantees on all the weapons, assistance, the training. I mean, there's U.S. Special Forces in Ukraine training Ukrainian troops. And then, like you said, the CIA has been training them inside the U.S. for a while now. And yeah, and NATO holds like big military exercises in Ukraine. And that is another aspect of the Russian security proposals, is they want some kind of deal on like the deployment of each other's military, like near their border or in areas that they view as like a threat. Of course, NATO in the Black Sea and Ukraine, that's obviously, Russia will view that as a threat. And you see the U.S. kind of some hypocrisy recently. They said, because Russia just sent some troops to Belarus to do some exercises, they're saying, oh, this could just be a cover for an invasion of Ukraine. It's like, well, then all the U.S. and NATO exercises in countries that border Russia, by that logic, or the bombers that fly 12 miles off the coast of Russia, they're cover for an invasion of Russia. So, yeah, and there are a lot of factors in the Biden administration that, want to at least keep the status quo, want to keep the tensions up. There's tons of interest in sending them more weapons. So you said they authorized another 200 million. I'm kind of losing track now, because Biden said at the press conference he sent them 600 million so far during his term. And so I'm not sure what the total was for 2021. This year, the Pentagon signed off on not the Pentagon, the National Defense Authorization Act authorizes 300 million for Ukraine, and then some senators introduced a bill that would authorize another 500 million if Biden determined that Russia was being aggressive towards Ukraine. So it does seem like it would be really tough to slow down all this momentum. And you mentioned Germany. Germany's kind of an interesting factor here, because the new government, they're not getting on board with sending Ukraine weapons. I think they do want this pipeline up and running. So yeah, I just don't see, the Biden administration really committing to like limiting their cooperation with Ukraine. But, who knows what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's always the interesting thing. We really don't get to see very much of it. Exactly, what's all happening in the Biden administration too, and how much I mean, if Biden isn't paying that much attention to what's happening with Russia, because he's all worried about COVID and hearing briefings on that all day long, and the filibuster and voting rights, and everybody picking on Kamala Harris or whatever the hell else everybody thinks is an important issue, then how much does, say, Jade Sullivan, who just had a call with probably Michael McFall and the rest of the Hods, influencing this without Biden really getting to set the tone and everything like that, and what kind of position could he find himself in then? But there's another interesting part of this where I think Biden, kind of has an important realization that there's a spectrum of what could happen if Russia should try to not invade Ukraine, but like, let's say the Donbass region decided to once again try to join the Russian, the Russian Federation, become part of Russia or something like that. Then how would the U.S. respond? Biden didn't give like a specific example, but kind of said that like, hey, there's some room here. If Russia does something, it's not going to necessarily trigger like the full-on response. And then the White House came up and said like, no, that's not true. And so I thought this was interesting, but it's also, at least by my count, the third time that this has happened in the administration where Biden, who hasn't given that many press conferences and interviews, once, I think this was in April or March, said that Iran shouldn't be allowed to enrich uranium, which was never the standard, of course. It's not the standard within the JCPOA. And the White House had walked that back. And then he seemed to say, give an implicit guarantee to Taiwan. I think that was at a CNN town hall. And the White House, again, kind of walked that back and said the strategic ambiguity policy is still in place and everything. And here we have a third time of that. And that's, I don't know, very interesting that this continues to happen. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah. So what he said was like, again, jumbled, so it's hard to repeat the exact quote because I just couldn't figure it out. But he said something like, oh, if it's a minor incursion, we might. And then he kind of stopped. But he hinted that, like, if it's a minor incursion, then they might not really respond. And you got to figure that, like you said, a minor incursion could be Russia just taking those areas in the Donbass, moving in and setting up a perimeter, and that's that. So, and throughout the whole press conference, he kept like kind of rambling and then being like, maybe I shouldn't talk about that publicly. So I think he is like crossing some wires about things they're talking about behind the scenes. And that probably is a realistic thing. Like the minor incursion, they probably, they might have been telling something like that to Ukraine behind closed doors.
I guess too, just to point out that if you want to be real technical with the way that the West draws the maps and everything, Russian troops are in Ukraine, like in Crimea or in the Donbass, and so depending on how literal somebody wants to be with the way they're talking about these words and these lines, then maybe Biden is just trying to save himself a little bit of wiggle room so nobody then tries to like press him on, what I mean, like trip him up one of these reporters, because there are a ton of thoughts in the room. And I guess that's maybe the one last thing I want to ask you on this, Dave, is just all the reporting on this is overly hawkish, right? But they keep citing this number. There's 100,000 Russian troops on the Ukrainian border. And they've been citing that same number before and after Christmas, which, of course, Russia moved 10,000 troops away from the border on Christmas. And they've always used the word about. And so I guess like 90,000 is about 100,000. And so but at the same time, there's no acknowledgement of that troop drawdown. And there's very rarely, if ever, reporting on the amount of Ukrainian troops built up on the border of the Donbass region, the separatist region in Ukraine. And so I was wondering if you just had an idea of how many Russian troops were on the border versus how many Ukrainian troops have been built up along the border.
I really have no idea because they're not on the border. They're not like standing at the border looking into Ukraine. They're at bases in the region in Western Russia, and most of them are like over 100 miles away from the border. I know one, this is just from reports I read when not when it first started, but when it started really heating up. They had all these satellite images, and the bases, one was closer to the border of Belarus in the north there. And one of them is the base in Crimea on the Black Sea. It's not there. It's not like an inland base in Crimea. It's on the Black Sea. And, they've reinforced these areas. So I really don't know. It's tough to figure out because so they say they send like 10,000 troops to this one base where there's already like 20,000. Is the U.S. counting that as 30,000 troops near the border? And then the 10,000 troops that left that one base that returned from drills, that also could have just been part of a regular rotation. And I've heard Russia say that Ukraine has like 100, like half their army near the conflict zone, the Donbass, which is like 100,000, similar number.
Yeah.
But again, I really don't know. But it's definitely reinforcement. But again, you look at that base in Crimea, and you look at the past year, how much U.S. and NATO activity has increased in the Black Sea. To me, that's a response to that. So, I don't see them planning to invade from Crimea, Belarus, Western Russia to like take out the government. I mean, I just don't see that being a plan at all.
Yep. All right, Dave. Well, let's talk about Iran because this is real important, and I want you because you follow this so closely and have throughout the whole Biden administration. We're now at a point where the U.S. is publicly saying we only have a few weeks left to save the deal for whatever the hell reason. They're now, or I guess the Biden administration has, been saying for what 6 or 8 months, like the deal could become less valuable if we wait longer to get back in it. So there's a ticking clock on it, but how do they end up passing up on taking the deal with Rouhani? I guess during the first half of the administration, and now they seem backed into a corner. And do you think they'll have to just take a deal to get back into the JCPOA because there's really not a good alternative? Or what? I guess just talk about the Biden's Iran policy, Dave. I'll let you start from wherever you think is a good place.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is, he got himself into a real, pickle here because, like you said, he first came in, they started negotiations with the previous Iranian government under Rouhani. And, that took a while. He said right when he would come into office, he would work with Iran to return to the deal. I think those talks started in April, so a few months after he came in. And they lasted till June. And as we know from a report in Responsible Statecraft by Trita Parsi, they pretty much reached a deal that would lift most major sanctions that Iran was really concerned about. In exchange, Iran, they want guarantees that the U.S. won't pull out of the deal again, which is pretty reasonable, I would say, because the U.S. did that already. But the JCPOA isn't a treaty. It's just like a political agreement. And so they can't give legal guarantees for future administrations. But the Biden administration, the Rouhani government agreed to limit it to Biden promising that he won't leave the deal during his term in office. And Biden wouldn't do that, and they didn't reach a deal. So then Raisi gets elected, and they return to the talks at the end of November, and the Biden administration wanted them to just accept that deal on sanctions relief that they reached with Rouhani. And of course, Raisi was never going to do that. So we had this whole show for about a month of the U.S. just saying, they're completely making just ridiculous demands. And so they finally kind of accepted, okay, we have to give them some real sanctions relief. It seems like the U.S. has acknowledged that. And Biden said yesterday that there's some progress being made, whatever that means. It's been the vague line since the beginning of this month. But it comes down to the guarantees. There was a report in the Wall Street Journal recently that said it's pretty much all about the guarantees and the verifications for sanctions relief. Because, if you look at it, if they lift sanctions, it might take a while. And to get the benefits from it, they can't do any like long-term planning if the next president, which is, things can change very quickly. But my guess is that the next election, presidential election, a Republican's probably going to win, and pretty much every Republican is bad on Iran and the JCPOA, so they could just pull right out of it again and throw those sanctions back on. So Iran knows that, and they're not going to settle for, kind of a BS deal. But again, what Biden's hands are kind of tied for what he can guarantee, and he really just shot himself in the foot by not agreeing to that, which sounded like a pretty good deal from the U.S. The deal with Rouhani. And now, a year later, but Iran's still under all these sanctions. Biden's imposed more sanctions. They've been coordinating with Israel and threatening Iran. It's been a complete repeat of the Trump administration's policy, except that they're actually in these indirect negotiations. So they got a concession out of Iran, but it doesn't seem like it's really been paying off for them. So, but again, at the same time, Iran's been pretty positive publicly about the whole thing, and I don't know what Raisi's interest would be to like kind of project that if that's not really what's happening, because he is, a hardliner as they call him, so he wouldn't be too shy to say, they're, just blame everything on the U.S. So I guess we'll just, it's a matter of time. The U.S. is now, these U.S. officials are warning there's only a few weeks left, and they're pinning like early February as the deadline, and saying like, it's too late. Their nuclear program is advancing too much, but that's just nonsense, because really the big thing right now is these centrifuges they're using. They could turn them off, and that'll be verified by the IAEA and inspections. The uranium enrichment, they can bring it back down, and it's not like they don't know how to enrich uranium at 90%. That's kind of what they make it seem like. They're like, oh, they're learning too much about how to make nuclear weapons, and they're going to have this knowledge if we don't return to the deal within like a month. But they know how to do that. It's not like it's a secret. So,
Right. Right. And so I guess, one thing, if you're talking about the Iran policy, you also have to talk about the Israel policy, because in April, right after Biden announced that, we're going to start talking with the Iranians, the indirect talks in Vienna that have been going on for like 10 months now. The Israelis carried out an attack on an Iranian ship in the Red Sea. And since then, there's just been various other sabotage acts and, the continued Israeli bombing of, Iranian allied forces in Syria, and just a lot of actions against Iran by, Israel. And so I guess, and Biden hasn't stood up and said anything all along about it. It seems like maybe that would be an essential part of this for Iran, is to somehow rein in the Israelis. And if the Biden administration isn't telling them to like knock it off and stop doing this, then I don't think the chances of really reviving the deal could be all that high, because it's going to be very easy for the Israelis to just tank it, right? Which is essentially what they've been doing for like the past 10 months, is everything they can to make sure talks really can't progress.
Yeah. I mean, I remember there was a report, I forget if it was New York Times or what, but it said that the Biden administration told Israel, cool it with the covert attacks. I think this was right before the new round of talks started. And the report said Israel said no, that they were going to continue them. But there hasn't been any since they restarted the talks in Vienna. But, there's always stuff going behind the scenes, and, they've been bombing Syria constantly, as they always do. And when they attacked the Natanz nuclear facility, when the talks restarted in April, the U.S., they couldn't even publicly say that's a bad, don't do that.
Right.
Even though, without acknowledging it was Israel, they could have just said, yeah, that's not a good thing to do, to sabotage a nuclear facility. Think about how dangerous that is. And Israel has been threatening that if the deal's restored, they're going to attack Iran on their own. And the U.S. just hasn't had anything to say, no, you're not, or anything. But,
right.
So, and, the political pressure is another thing, because you think about the House and the Senate right now, pretty much every Republican will be against rejoining the JCPOA.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not Rand Paul, but I don't even know. I think he was against
He was bad on it at first, so yeah. It's not a constitutional treaty.
Yeah. So, and then you have enough hawkish Democrats, Iran hawk Democrats, that, the majority of Congress might be against giving Iran sanctions relief.
Yeah.
So maybe that's another reason why he didn't do the deal with Rouhani, because of the Afghanistan withdrawal. Everybody was giving them crap for that. So the political fallout to do both at the same time would have been pretty intense. You think of all the stupid talking points. They're giving Afghanistan to the terrorists, and they're letting the terrorists in Iran have, sell their oil or whatever they would say. So, and that gets into Yemen too. If you want to talk about Yemen,
Yeah, yeah.
unless we're on
I
Iran.
was just gonna mention with that Bob Menendez is terrible and a very powerful Democrat in the Senate, and so that's I think one major barrier that Biden would have. But I guess the closer we get to November and the elections, Dave, the more I think, or the less likely it seems that Biden would get back into the deal because the more the Republicans will throw it against him. That's why it just seems so unbelievable that like May and June of last year, when not only could they have gotten back in the deal and maybe impacted you know, better 2022 because if the Republicans are all hysterical last summer about it, and then I mean people generally care less because the pandemic's going on anyway, and I think that was even somewhat the case with Afghanistan. But by now people have certainly forgotten it, and as long as there's no major confrontation with Iran going on in the fall of 2022, then I don't think Americans are really gonna care. But again, the longer he waits, the harder it's gonna be. But also then like maybe it could have impacted the Iranian elections, and I don't know if Rouhani would have gotten reelected or if a moderate would have gotten reelected. But maybe you have a little bit less of a unfriendly Iranian government. I don't know, but it's just something to think about. All that was possible, but he waited and waited and waited, and so now we are where we are, and I guess after it took so long, it just seemed more and more unlikely to me, and now I'm pretty pessimistic on it. Although I know Connor Freeman, who's the co-host of this show, is a little bit more optimistic than I am right now. So I don't know if you have any overall like final last thoughts on what you think may happen if the Biden administration is serious about the deadline. And I guess you're still operating, and so am I, under the assumption that Iran really doesn't want to make nuclear weapons and wouldn't with or without the JCPOA. And in some ways, I guess Iran does view the nuclear deal as maybe somewhat protecting them against Israeli and American propaganda on the nuclear issue.
Yeah. I mean, I think they just really want to, be able to sell their oil and stuff. So I think it is worth it to them to reach an agreement with Biden. But it just comes down to how much are they willing to concede, and what that will look like, politically for both sides. So I really can't say. I mean, it's tough to predict what's going to happen next because it's so vague, a lot of the public comments. Mm-hmm. So we'll see. If Iran's attitude is more to the side of truth, then we might have a better chance than it appears. So hopefully that's the case.
Yeah. All right, last thing on Iran now. So I saw today, I don't know if you saw this, China at least was saying that they were carrying out joint naval operations with Iran and Russia in the Gulf of Oman. And it does seem that Biden has somewhat solidified a lot of the Trump policies towards America's adversaries, whether that's Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, China, Russia, North Korea, Syria. Essentially, he's kept all the same policies in place, right? And it seems that, I don't know, there are more and more things happening between particularly Russia and China and then Iran. But I don't know, what do you think about this trend of like maybe these countries starting to just form more ties and caring less and less about U.S. sanctions? If Iran could sell gas to countries that are all sanctioned by the United States, maybe that's enough gas for them to sell to run their economy, and they could just not care about the nuclear deal and things like that.
Yeah, well, that's a big factor, because oil sales to China have been like a big lifeline for Iran, and this is a consequence of the U.S. just trying to like bully all these countries. I mean, you look at Venezuela and Iran, and like, okay, well, I think Venezuela needed gas, and Iran has gas and Venezuela had gold, so they traded gas for gold, and the U.S. can't touch that. Actually, well, I shouldn't say that because they did they stole some of these shipments, which is just, I mean, it's just so brazen. So that sort of U.S. attitude is going to kind of push the creation of this alternate, maybe global financial system and trade partnerships between China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea is possible. There's other countries, maybe Nicaragua, Syria. They just joined the China's Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, what the U.S. is doing in that country is just so shameful. And Afghanistan too. I'm surprised that Russia and China haven't already just like normalized with the Taliban. But maybe I guess they have their own interests there too that they want to get out of them. But yeah, I mean, and we'll just keep seeing this expand. And it's just such an obvious result of America's foreign policy that anybody that acts surprised by Russia, China, and Iran doing naval drills or signing trade deals is just doesn't know what's going on.
Right. All right, so you're talking about shameful things that America is doing, Dave. We got to talk about Yemen here. And Biden came in office and promised, well, as a candidate, he was saying, we're going to turn Saudi Arabia into the pariah state they are. In early February, almost a year ago now, he says we're ending offensive weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. And honestly, if you're looking at the U.S.-Saudi policy, it hasn't changed any from the Trump administration. And so I guess it's kind of gotten ignored. And I don't know, what do you think, like, overall Biden's policy, and then of course the situation in Yemen?
Oh yeah, Biden's policy with Saudi Arabia. Well, one thing that has happened, I mean, I don't think this is really that important now, is that the U.S. they are repositioning kind of from the Middle East to the Asia Pacific. Although I think the current troop levels now are kind of what they're going to try to stick with. But as part of that, they took some like Patriot missiles out of Saudi Arabia. But I mean, Trump just sent them there in like 2018 or 2019, I think. But the Saudis, kind of are freaking out about that. And when Biden got into office, he suspended some arms sales to Saudi Arabia. But since then, he's approved new ones. He approved a missile sale. I think it's $650 million. A helicopter maintenance deal for $500 million. So he's approved over $1 billion in arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And then the Khashoggi thing. I mean, I think they didn't even name MBS in their report on it, or they didn't sanction him or anything. So that was all just for show. And when it comes to Yemen, I mean, at first I was kind of hopeful because he came into office and he reversed the Houthi terror designation, which the Trump administration made. It was like one of their last moves, and it's pretty much, so they would have designated the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, which pretty much means doing any kind of business with them is criminalized by the U.S. You'll be targeted by U.S. sanctions. So the Houthis control most of North Yemen, which is where Yemen's starving, where most of the starving, food-deprived population is. And the Houthis are the authorities there. So that was criminalizing delivering them food. So Biden came in and reversed it. And now we have this Houthi attack in the UAE. And at the press conference yesterday, he said redesignating the Houthis as terrorists was under consideration. And, since a year ago when he lifted it, if anything, things are worse now. I mean, people are starting to become more self-sufficient, I guess, and are getting by better under the Houthi-controlled areas than they were. But the bombing campaign has really ramped up, and it really spiked at the end of 2021. Saudis have just been bombing the hell out of Yemen, and they're still blocking oil tankers from docking in Hodeidah. I think the death toll now is 377,000. So, if he does this designation again, it's not going to do anything to the Houthis. That's kind of the important point. If you look at it from like policy-wise, it doesn't make any sense because the Houthis, most leaders are under U.S. sanctions. None of them have U.S. assets. It doesn't affect them, but it will affect delivery of the one thing that this Saudi coalition lets into Yemen, which is aid and fuel and it can hinder that, and all it would do is hurt the civilians. So the fact that that's even a thought is just no good. And the UAE attack, the Houthis launched ballistic missiles and drones at Abu Dhabi, killed 3 people, and the UAE, this is why Biden said it was under consideration, because they want them to redesignate the Houthis as terrorists. But the UAE, I mean, they've been part of this coalition that's just been bombing the hell out of Yemen for so long. And in recent battles around Marib and other areas where the Houthis are fighting, like this Saudi-backed government, the UAE is funding these militant groups that's fighting the Houthis. And I've seen some reporting that says they're funding for a group called the Giants Brigade in Yemen. There has been pretty significant in the Saudi-backed forces' recent success on the battlefield against the Houthis. So to act like this attack came out of nowhere is frustrating to see people say that. But one thing that's interesting is that the UAE, as far as I've seen, they're not blaming Iran. Because if you remember, when the Houthis, they're always sending drones and stuff across the border into Saudi Arabia. But when they did that major attack in September 2019 and really did some damage to Saudi oil facilities, the whole narrative was Iran. The Houthis could not do this themselves. Iran. And that's because it fit the narrative of the Trump administration at the time to kind of ratchet up tensions with Iran. And if you look at the spot in Abu Dhabi that they hit, that's further away from Houthi territory than these areas in Saudi Arabia. Now, this was another talking point. That big Saudi attack was that their drones couldn't reach that far. But then you just look back at areas that the Houthis have hit, and they did hit targets further than those Saudi targets. And they've claimed attacks in the UAE before at the Abu Dhabi airport that the UAE usually denied them. They didn't do much, but it did seem like they happened because there's video footage of them and stuff. So they can reach pretty far. And then, of course, the talking point is they can only do it because Iran, gives them these weapons. But there's not really any evidence to back that up. I mean, there's a blockade on the country, and Lloyd Austin, he recently talked with I forget his name, but a UAE official, and they discussed what they said: enhancing maritime security to prevent weapons from getting in Yemen, which means tightening the blockade even more. Well, at this point, the blockade hasn't done anything to slow the Houthis' weapons advancements. So why is tightening it more going to help? I mean, they have the technology there, and they know how to develop it and produce it themselves. So again, tightening the blockade is just going to hurt the people more. So we're kind of just back at square one in Yemen, and it's not looking good.
I guess I will say maybe one significant thing about moving the Patriot missiles out of Saudi Arabia is, since that happened, the Saudis have had to use their own ammunition for their Patriot missile systems. And so now they need more of them, and they're, freaking out because they want, more of those interceptor missiles and things like that. I think they've even tried to get some from the Qataris or something. But, that does create an opportunity in Congress to block that weapons sale. And if the Saudis really do run out of interceptors, that could create a real problem. Now, maybe they would solve that by making a deal with the Israelis or something, but they could also solve that by making a deal with the Houthis. On the terror designation label, this is absolutely unbelievable, isn't it, Dave? That you have the UAE that's backing this Giants Brigade, which is a bunch of Salafists on the ground in Yemen, far more of a terrorist act than launching a drone attack against another country. I mean, maybe the Salafists are fighting against the Houthis, and the Houthis are bombing a oil facility, and unfortunately, the migrant workers of the UAE are the ones that pay the price for the royals' crimes. But I mean, it is pretty much more of a military attack than most of the things that the Saudis and the Emiratis do in Yemen. And so to label that a terrorist act is is absolutely crazy. And the fact that Biden wouldn't laugh and be like, they're at war. Like, they're constantly bombing the Houthis, and the Houthis fire a shot back, and now you want us to label them terrorists and like cut off all this aid. It's absolutely insane, but that's what they're talking about doing. And I I guess, yeah. It's just the Yemen policy has been one of the more unbelievable things to me. It's almost completely flown under the radar. For a few of the Democrats who are good on it under Trump, like Chris Murphy, are now like, oh well, Biden's good enough, so he said he was cutting the weapon sales and things, and they're no longer standing up on it. And the Republicans, you can't really count on them for anything, and so we're. I see once again, essentially nobody really interested in Congress and Yemen in ending this thing, even though it's the cruelest war. Now, I guess that it's so bad and more people are finding out about it. I guess my real hope is, Dave, is that it's actually people that use the opportunity of the Patriot missile sales, and the next time Saudi Arabia needs this weapons or that weapon. So what do you think about any chances, or what are your thoughts on, I guess the movement and people just, saying enough of this, we're tired of slaughtering these people?
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of good, people, lobbyists and stuff in Washington on this issue, because, like you said, it is just so cruel, and it serves no purpose. And the UAE, they have they've been backing out, using Al Qaeda to fight the Houthis. So yeah, they can't really call the Houthis terrorists. So yeah, I mean, I'm not too, I don't have much of a positive outlook on this, because the Senate couldn't block that air-to-air missile sale, as they like to say that they're only air-to-air missiles, so they're not offensive because they can't bomb Yemen with them. But so a Patriot missile sale, I don't think they would be able to block that. Like, if they just put it through right now, I think it would go through. So yeah, I mean, more people just have to become aware of it, because as we saw during the Trump administration, that grassroots movement really, they got that war powers resolution introduced, and it passed through Congress, but of course Trump vetoed it. So if that could happen again, I mean, this has happened for the past few years. Ro Khanna introduced an amendment to the NDAA that would have ended support for the war with no loopholes in it, and it got passed in the House to be in the NDAA, but then it was stripped when they negotiated the conference with the Senate. So like a war powers resolution right now, if it was introduced, would it pass? I would hope so, but it's tough to say.
Yeah. And then you probably lose, the few Democrats in the House that were just doing it because they thought it was anti-Trump or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
and now they would, abstain or not vote, and AOC would probably cry about it, but ultimately she would vote for war. So yeah, I guess I'm kind of with you on a little bit of the pessimism there, Dave. I mean, I think that pretty much gets through what I want to cover with you today. I mean, there's so many horrible things the U.S.'s government is doing, and you do such a great job of covering it at antiwar.com. So I don't know, any final overall thoughts? Again, you're one of the closest watchers of Biden's foreign policy. For people who write up articles, you've probably written up the most about them. So yeah, any kind of just final overall thoughts of is this what you expected to see from Biden? Are you surprised by some things?
Well, I will say, I mean, the one positive thing that we have to, well, this is actually not really that positive anymore because of the sanctions and stuff, but we are out of Afghanistan. That was a nice surprise that we actually got out.
Yeah.
But now the U.S. is still holding on to, I think it's $9 billion in the government funds, and keeping sanctions on the country, and it looks like it's gonna get really bad there. And Biden doesn't seem to have any interest in releasing the money and lifting the sanctions. So unfortunately, we can't celebrate that too much now. But I just think when Biden was coming in, the momentum to shift towards the great power competition as they call it, and really shift to Asia and really shift to China was started being built up during the Trump administration. And I saw as Biden was coming in, no matter what the rhetoric was, like that was the way things were still going to go, and that is what happened. And you can really see it over the past year. So I started at like the end of 2019 tracking the amount of U.S. military activity in the South China Sea and stuff like that, because it's just you can put a number on it. You can see that how the U.S. is really focusing on China. And over the past year, I mean, Biden just ramped it up even more, like more so than Trump did. The latest thing I wrote up on it was the aircraft carrier strike groups. They sent 10 aircraft carrier strike groups entered the South China Sea in 2021, compared with 6 the year before, which, that's a significant thing. And then you have the AUKUS deal with the UK and Australia. So as much as there's all these Russia hawks in the Biden administration, Newland and Blinken and all these horrible people that would not mind, sucking Russia into a war in Ukraine, I still think the ultimate long-term thing here is China. So I think that's just something people need to keep in mind. And I mean, Taiwan, I mean, there's this, I think her name is Elaine Luria. She's a House representative from Virginia. She represents like Virginia Beach area, Norfolk, I think. I don't know if it's the same district there, but there's a lot of shipyards and stuff there. And she wants to give Biden authorization to go to war with China over Taiwan. Like now, she wants to give that to him. So if China invades, he can respond right away. And I mean, that's what we're kind of dealing with. I mean, how insane of a thought is that we would go to war with China it's as crazy as going to war with Russia over Ukraine.
Right.
So, and this is a Democrat, because you've always had your Tom Cotton's kind of crazy Russia hawk, crazy China hawks that have said that, but now we're going to start seeing this from the Democrats. And so that's what kind of really unnerves me. And again, I feel like I say this every time I'm on here and I talk about China, but in order to really have a hot war with China, we need an economic decoupling. And that would be a slow, long process if they actually go for it. But you're starting to see some things. Biden signed a bill that would ban imports from Xinjiang unless they can prove that there's no forced labor in the supply chain. But so that'll be like a matter of, okay, how willing are they to give waivers for that? Because they can just say that they're lying,
Right.
So,
I guess the good thing is, right, that like the people who would get waivers would be like Coca-Cola and Nike and things like that. Companies that have the resources to hire lawyers and former, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama administration officials that now have lobbying firms to go send those lawyers into Congress and talk with the right people at the Treasury Department or wherever the hell that you need to like. So I guess my hope is that like, the corruption of the United States and, on the market Wall Street side will be more powerful than the corruption of the United States on the military industrial complex side. However, I might just be, wishing a little bit there.
Well, I think that's a pretty major, that legislation is kind of a tell. It's pretty major because you think of all the big corporations you could think of have, do some kind of business in Xinjiang.
And some of them lobbied against it, like directly lobbied against this. I think Coca-Cola was one. And so, I mean,
and Nike too, I think.
Yeah.
Or no, actually Nike, there was like a report that said Nike did, but then they denied that they lobbied against it, but they probably did. But so, and you think about, this passed through the House and Senate unanimously. I think Thomas Massie voted against it in the House. That was it. I mean, that's saying something, because all these people in Congress, they have interest in these corporations making money in China. So there's a shift happening.
Yeah.
And it might not be about the corporations making money right now. I think it's more kind of about power, and then the military industrial complex is probably going to win the power struggle. But this stuff with China, it's just, it's scary. And it's scary how kind of propagandized everybody is about China. Everybody hates China now.
Yeah. No, and that's the last thing I wanted to ask you. And this is the reason that the China issue I think is actually a little bit more concerning than Russia. Because on Russia at least, you got Tucker Carlson, you got like, the Russiagate skeptic crowd, so like some of the left is there, but also like, just some of the right-wing people who happen to be good on Russiagate are skeptical of like the whole Ukraine invasion issue and things like that. On the China issue, you have nobody. Tucker Carlson, Tim Pool. Reason Magazine is running like reviews on books from the New Lines Institute, saying that there's a genocide going on against the Uyghurs. I mean, there's almost no resistance. There's nobody that is any good on it. Hell, even like, the people who don't want intervention against China are, especially if they're anywhere remotely like on the libertarian or right side, have to spend the first like 10 minutes of anything they say, well, the CCP is really bad at, Taiwan and Hong Kong and the South China Sea and these islands and reefs and in the Senkaku Islands and the Uyghurs and the Tibetans. And they have all these things that they'll go and qualify everything they say before, we probably shouldn't go to war with them though. And so there's almost nobody on the China issue that's willing to make any kind of reasonable defense unless maybe they're Maoist, which is almost worse, right?
Yeah.
And so where do you like, who do you think is like doing some like analysis and work on the China issue?
Oh man, I mean, besides us and people we're close with, man, I'm like just blanking out right now because it's really tough to think of anybody. Um, yeah, I mean, I know like Robbie Martin has done some stuff. He's pretty against this escalation with China, and there's other people, but like people besides Robbie, like anybody with like a big audience, like some of the big names, I can't really think of anybody. I mean, Dave Smith is good on this stuff. I don't know how much he focuses on it though, because it does need more attention than it's getting from a lot of people. Of course Scott Horton, but he is included in people close to us. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, you got to think about it. Like, could you imagine somebody going on Tucker? I think McGregor said something when he was on there. Like, Tucker was like, "Oh, Colonel, what do you think about all the Chinese building ports in the Caribbean?" And McGregor just kind of turned it around. He's like, "Well, I think if you look at the South China Sea, the U.S. is antagonizing China." And Tucker just made his dumb face. So that was good. And he's a good guy. He's pretty good on everything, McGregor.
Mm-hmm.
So he's good. Get the American conservative.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some bad China stuff in there too, but they also have Peter Van Buren, who's been really good.
Yeah.
And Basevich, I think he's been writing about China recently. Maybe not.
I do know like the Quincy Institute, of course, usually has like some good stuff, but I was more like thinking like a little bit more in the mainstream. You know what I mean? Like Tim Pool has a big audience and things and something like that where, I talk about the Quincy Institute to people, and most people don't know what I'm talking about. If I bring up Tim Pool, like most people are like, at least they, even if they like instinctually kind of don't like him because their narrative against him is just like he's a bad guy, they kind of know who he is. You talk about the Quincy Institute, they don't even know they're supposed to hate it. But McGregor is a good example of somebody who will get on Tucker Carlson and isn't somebody who is at all favorable towards the CCP, and at the same time won't advocate for intervention or play along with any of those stupid games. So
yeah, and of course Ron Paul and Dan McAdams. And they have a pretty good size audience.
That's very true.
Yeah, I mean, Tim Pool, you think of it, there is like the mainstream media, and then there's also like the independent media, but a lot of these independent media people, they get more views than CNN, like Tim Pool, and he's pretty bad on China, and he's bad on Russia too. I saw him do some segment, and he was saying like Putin wanted to restore the Soviet Union, and the only two people I heard say that during this whole thing was Victoria Nuland and Tim Pool. Like, he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about on this.
Right.
Like, it's funny because I've seen him do this with China. He just loaded up like some mainstream news articles and just read them, and that was his coverage. So he doesn't foreign policy, he's really bad. And a lot of people watch that. So Scott went on there and pushed back against some of the China stuff, and you looked at the chat, and everybody's calling him a commie, and
Yeah.
it's a pretty sorry state. So I think we got to work on it and kind of get the message out more.
All right, Dave, thanks so much for coming back on the show. We'll have to do it again soon. And everybody, check out antiwar.com. Dave and Jason Ditz are writing the news section every day. There's so much. I don't know how you do it. Some days I go on there and you got like 4, 5, 6, 7 new articles. Absolutely crazy. But thanks so much for what you're doing, Dave, and all the important stuff that's on antiwar.com. You have so much involvement in it. So, anyways, yeah, thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Kyle.